The summer heat was unbearable as the prison transport van pulled up to Steel Gate's maximum security prison. Inside, a new inmate sat quietly, his eyes fixed on the chains around his ankles. The most noticeable thing about him wasn't his broad shoulders or his stern face. It was the intricately designed cross tattoo that stretched across the right side of his neck. The guards weren't strangers to religious tattoos. They'd seen everything from prayer verses to saints, but something about this one made them exchange worried glances. Maybe it was how fresh it looked, or maybe it was the way the inmate's fingers kept brushing against it, like he was counting prayer beads that weren't there. "Step out," barked the senior guard, his hand resting on his belt. The inmate moved with an unusual grace for someone in shackles. Most new arrivals stumbled or shuffled, but he stepped down from the van like he was walking into a business meeting. His prison jumpsuit was crisp, almost like he pressed it himself. The intake process was standard: fingerprints, photographs, medical check. The prison doctor raised an eyebrow at the cross tattoo, making a note in the file. "Religious affiliation?" he asked, not looking up from his paperwork. The inmate's response was so soft they had to ask him to repeat it. "Personal reasons," he said, a little smile playing at the corners of his mouth. His paperwork showed nothing special, just another small-time criminal who'd finally gone too far. Breaking and entering, theft, nothing violent. But Officer Chen, who'd been working intake for 15 years, felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He learned to trust that feeling. During the cell block walk, other inmates pressed against their bars, sizing up the newcomer. Usually, new arrivals showed fear, anger, or tried to look tough. This one just observed, his eyes moving slowly from cell to cell, like he was reading a book. The cross tattoo seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights, making some inmates cross themselves as he passed. The guard assigned to his cell block, Officer Thompson, a usually chatty man who'd been working there for decades, found himself speaking in whispers around the new inmate. "There's something off about this one," he told his wife that night over dinner. "Can't put my finger on it. He's polite, quiet, keeps to himself. But when he looks at you, it's like he's looking right through you." The first night, while other new inmates tossed and turned or cried in their cells, he sat on his bed, perfectly still, staring at the wall. The night guard doing rounds swore he didn't move for hours. Just sat there, occasionally touching that cross tattoo like he was sending some kind of signal. By the end of his first week, the prison staff had labeled him a potential religious extremist in their reports. They increased surveillance on his cell, monitored his movements in the yard, and watched who he talked to during meals. But they were looking so hard for signs of religious radicalization that they missed everything else. The way he always chose different tables in the cafeteria, giving him views of all the exits. How he noted which guards were right-handed and which were left. How he could name every staff member's shift schedule after just 7 days. The prison librarian gave him a job shelving books, thinking it would keep him occupied. She didn't realize that from the library's upper level, you could see the entire prison layout, including the guard towers and delivery gates. Or that the library's old computer still had access to the prison's outdated building plans. That cross tattoo became his shield. Everyone was so busy worrying about what it meant that they didn't notice what he was actually doing. Staff members started calling him the quiet one or church boy, labels that made them feel like they understood him. They didn't realize that every assumption they made about him was exactly what he wanted them to think. As the sun set on his first month at Steel Gates, he lay on his thin prison mattress, fingers tracing the cross on his neck. In the darkness, a small smile crossed his face. Everything was going exactly according to plan. Life in Steel Gates prison fell into a steady rhythm during those first few months. The inmate with the cross tattoo became a familiar sight in the chapel, always sitting in the back row, head bowed in what appeared to be deep prayer. The prison chaplain took a special interest in him, touched by his apparent devotion. "It's rare to see such dedication," the chaplain would tell his colleagues during their coffee breaks. The prison library became his second home. Between shelving books and helping other inmates find research materials, he spent hours reading. Everything from religious texts to old engineering manuals. The elderly librarian would often find him absorbed in books about architecture or electrical systems, which she assumed was his way of planning for a trade after release. "You know," she said one afternoon, watching him carefully organize the reference section, "most inmates don't take such pride in their work." He smiled that quiet smile of his and continued alphabetizing, his fingers occasionally brushing against the cross on his neck. She didn't notice how his eyes lingered on the ceiling panels where the prison's main power cables ran. During yard time, he developed a routine that the guards found comforting in its predictability. 20 minutes of slow, walking around the perimeter, 15 minutes of basic exercises, then finding a quiet spot to read or meditate. What they didn't realize was that each lap around the yard gave him a perfect view of the guard rotation patterns, the camera blind spots, and the weak points in the fence's electronic security system. Other inmates started coming to him for advice, drawn by his calm demeanor and listening skills. He never turned anyone away, but he never shared anything about himself either. Each conversation was like a deposit in an invisible bank of favors. A network of grateful prisoners who would remember his kindness. The kitchen staff noticed how he always volunteered for extra cleanup duty after meals. They praised his work ethic, not realizing he was memorizing delivery schedules and studying the loading dock's security procedures. "Such a humble man," the head cook would say, always willing to help with the heaviest work. During weekly phone calls, which he never missed, he spoke in low, measured tones about scripture and redemption. The guards monitoring the calls often tuned out, bored by what seemed like harmless religious discussions. They weren't trained to notice how certain words were emphasized or how some sentences seemed oddly placed. Even the most hardened inmates began to respect his space. There was something about him that didn't invite challenge. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, or how he could calm down heated situations with just a few quiet words. The prison gang leaders marked him as someone to leave alone, mistaking his strategic patience for religious conviction. One evening, during a power fluctuation that lasted exactly 6 minutes, none of the guards noticed him watching the backup generators kick in, timing each sequence with subtle taps of his fingers. To them, he was just another prisoner waiting for the lights to come back on, his cross tattoo catching the beam of their flashlights. The night shift guards grew used to seeing him awake during their rounds, apparently lost in prayer or meditation. They didn't know he was counting their steps, measuring their patrol intervals, noting which ones were diligent and which ones were lazy about checking the shadows. As his third month drew to a close, the prison administration actually reduced his threat level. His file now described him as a model prisoner with strong religious convictions. The cross tattoo, once seen as a warning sign, had become a symbol of his presumed reformation. Little did they know that every assumption they made, every guard they reassigned away from watching him, every privilege they granted, was another piece falling into place. That night, as the prison settled into its usual quiet, he lay on his bunk, a small notebook hidden in his mattress filled not with prayers or confessions, but with detailed observations, timings, and calculations. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of the next phase, and as always, that cross tattoo would continue to be his perfect disguise. By his 4th month at Steel Gates Prison, the inmate with the cross tattoo had built something extraordinary, a web of trust so subtle that no one could see its threads. The morning shift guard would bring him an extra breakfast roll, thinking of him as one of the good ones. The maintenance worker would chat with him about the weather, never noticing how their conversations always drifted toward the prison's aging electrical system. The prison chaplain had become his strongest supporter. "He's helped so many others find their way," the chaplain would tell the warden during their monthly meetings. What he didn't mention was how often the inmate volunteered to clean the chapel alone, or how he always seemed interested in the schedule of special services that brought visitors from outside. In the library, his influence grew quietly. Other inmates started coming to him for help with their appeal letters. He listened patiently, offered thoughtful advice, and somehow turned each interaction into a small debt owed. The elderly librarian was delighted by how he transformed her domain into a peaceful haven. She never questioned why he reorganized the technical manuals section, or why he spent so much time studying old blueprints of buildings similar to the prison. During group therapy sessions, he spoke just enough to seem engaged, but never enough to reveal anything real. It's part of the healing process, the prison counselor would note in his file. She didn't realize that each carefully chosen word was building a character, a mask that everyone readily believed. His network expanded beyond the chapel regulars. The kitchen workers slipped him extra food, the laundry crew made sure his uniforms were always cleaned first, and even the tough guys in the yard would nod respectfully as he passed. Each small favor was a thread in an invisible tapestry of influence. One rainy afternoon, the power flickered during a storm. While other inmates complained about the interrupted TV time, he sat perfectly still, counting the seconds between the power loss and the backup generator's response. The guard on duty just thought he was praying, the cross tattoo on his neck seeming to stand out in the emergency lighting. His cell became known as a place where problems got solved. Inmates would whisper their troubles, and somehow solutions would appear. Extra phone time, messages passed, favors granted. The guards noticed the traffic, but saw only a positive influence, a peacemaker. They didn't see how each solved problem added another loyal supporter to his unseen army. The prison doctor gave him light duty in the infirmary, impressed by his gentle way with injured inmates. Nobody questioned why he was so interested in the medical supply inventory, or why he paid such close attention during the mandatory fire evacuation drills. Even the most suspicious guard, a 20-year veteran who trusted no one, started to lower his guard. "Maybe we were wrong about that tattoo," he told his partner during a shift change. Seems like it really did mark a change in his life. They shared a laugh about their initial concerns, never suspecting that their every habit, their every routine, had been noted and filed away. Late at night, when the cell block was quiet except for the soft snores and mumbled dreams of other inmates, he would lie awake, mentally walking through every corridor, every security checkpoint, every camera angle. The cross tattoo that had made him a target now served as his perfect cover, a symbol of redemption that blinded everyone to the truth. As the lights dimmed for night lockdown, he smiled quietly to himself. His network was nearly complete, each person in place like pieces on a chessboard. The guards, the staff, the other inmates, all of them had roles to play in what was coming, though none of them knew it yet. Even the warden, who had recently praised his remarkable rehabilitation, was just another unwitting player in his elaborate game. That night, as the moon cast shadows through the cell window, he added another page to his hidden notebook. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned, and soon, very soon, everyone would understand just how dangerous a man with a cross tattoo could be. Everything changed when the new prisoner arrived. The man with the cross tattoo noticed him immediately during lunch period. A short, nervous-looking guy who couldn't stop staring in his direction. At first, the guards thought it was just another case of a newcomer being intimidated by the prison environment. They were wrong. The new prisoner's reaction wasn't fear. It was recognition. His hands shook so badly he spilled his food tray, eyes wide like he'd seen a ghost. The man with the cross tattoo kept eating calmly, but inside, his mind was already racing through possibilities and plans. During yard time that afternoon, the new prisoner made the mistake of getting too close. "I know who you are," he whispered, voice trembling. "I was there that night at the harbor. I saw what you did to Thos." Before he could finish, the man with the cross tattoo simply smiled and walked away, leaving the new prisoner standing there, pale and shaking. The next day, strange things started happening to the new arrival. His cell was mysteriously searched 3 times for contraband. His mail was accidentally delayed. The hot water would mysteriously stop working during his shower time. Small things, nothing that could be traced back to anyone, but enough to keep him off balance. In the library, the new prisoner tried to speak with the guard on duty. But before he could say anything important, two large inmates blocked his path. They weren't threatening. They didn't need to be. Their message was clear just by standing there, arms crossed. Nobody had told them to do this, but somehow they knew that the man with the cross tattoo preferred not to be disturbed. Word spread quietly through the prison that the new guy was a troublemaker, a liar who couldn't be trusted. Nobody knew who started these rumors, but they spread like wildfire. Even the usually friendly kitchen staff started giving him smaller portions. The guards, picking up on the general mood, watched him more closely, expecting problems. During chapel service, the man with the cross tattoo sat in his usual spot, appearing lost in prayer. The new prisoner sat near the door, nervously looking over his shoulder. The prison chaplain noticed the tension and tried to speak with the newcomer after the service, but he just mumbled something and hurried away. A week after the new prisoner's arrival, he requested protective custody, claiming he didn't feel safe in general population. The guards weren't surprised. They'd seen how isolated he'd become. What they didn't know was that every dirty look, every cold shoulder, every small act of exclusion had been orchestrated through a complex web of favors and whispered suggestions. The day the new prisoner was moved to solitary for his own protection, the man with the cross tattoo was working in the library, same as always. If anyone had been watching closely, they might have noticed how his fingers kept touching that cross on his neck, or how his eyes held a hint of satisfaction when the transfer was announced. That evening, during dinner, conversations in the cafeteria turned to how the new guy couldn't handle prison life. The guards shook their heads, discussing how some people just weren't cut out for it. Nobody connected his sudden transfer to the quiet man with the cross tattoo who sat peacefully eating his meal. In his cell that night, he made a small mark in his hidden notebook. The threat had been handled without a single act of violence, without raising any suspicions. His carefully built reputation remained intact: the peaceful religious man, the model prisoner, the calming influence. As lights out was called, he lay on his bunk, thinking about how close his plans had come to being exposed. But like everything else in this prison, even this potential disaster had worked to his advantage. Now the guards were even more convinced of his rehabilitation, and his influence among the inmates had grown stronger. The cross tattoo caught the dim light from the corridor, a shadow moving across its surface like a secret smile. In solitary confinement, far below, the only person who knew his true identity sat alone in the dark, too afraid to speak the truth to anyone who might listen. The detective arrived on a cold morning, her badge glinting in the weak sunlight as she passed through the prison gates. She'd spent 5 years tracking the mastermind behind the West Coast's biggest heists, and something about this prison's model inmate had caught her attention. The guards noticed how she kept touching the case file in her jacket pocket, like it was burning a hole through the fabric. At first, the prison staff thought it was just another routine investigation. The detective asked the usual questions, reviewed the usual files. But there was something different about the way she studied the security camera footage, rewinding certain sections again and again, especially the shots of the man with the cross tattoo. "Tell me about his daily routine," she asked the head guard, her eyes sharp and focused. The guard shrugged, describing the seemingly perfect prisoner: the chapel visits, the library work, the peaceful behavior. The detective's frown deepened with each word. "It's too perfect," she muttered, making notes in her small notebook. In the prison library, the elderly librarian defended him passionately. "He's helped transform this place," she insisted, showing the detective how well organized everything was. The detective noticed something the librarian hadn't: how the technical manuals were arranged to hide the fact that certain pages had been carefully removed. During lunch, the detective sat in the corner of the cafeteria, watching. The man with the cross tattoo ate his meal calmly, but she saw how other inmates seemed to move according to some unspoken pattern around him. Messages passed in subtle gestures, quick glances, the shifting of food trays. She interviewed the prison chaplain next. "His faith has touched many lives here," the chaplain said proudly. The detective's questions about the timing of his religious conversion and the meaning of his tattoo made the chaplain uncomfortable. "Why are you trying to undermine someone's redemption?" he asked, clearly protective. The warden was equally dismissive of her concerns. "We've had no problems with him," he said, reviewing the spotless behavior record. "Perhaps you're seeing shadows where there are none." The detective pulled out an old case file, spreading photos across the warden's desk. A series of perfectly executed crimes where no evidence was ever found. That afternoon, she stood in the yard, watching the man with the cross tattoo during his usual exercise routine. On the surface, everything looked normal. But her trained eye caught the subtle ways he tracked the guard rotations, how his peaceful meditation spot gave him clear views of all access points. The prison counselor shared the group therapy notes, full of vague, but apparently meaningful contributions. The detective read between the lines, seeing how each carefully chosen word revealed nothing while making everyone feel like they knew him. Classic manipulation, she whispered to herself. She requested access to his cell during yard time. Everything was neat, organized, regulation perfect. Too perfect. She had seen this before. Every item placed to create an image, a facade. But she couldn't find anything concrete, nothing to prove her suspicions. The man with the cross tattoo noticed her, of course. During dinner, he sat at a table where he could observe her taking notes. Their eyes met once across the cafeteria. He smiled politely, touching his cross tattoo in what appeared to be a habitual gesture. She saw it for what it was, a message, a small sign that he recognized the game they were playing. As the day ended, the detective stood in the parking lot, frustration evident in her stance. Her instincts screamed that she was right, that the perfect prisoner was anything but. Yet she had nothing solid, no proof to take to her superiors. Just a nagging feeling and a career's worth of experience telling her that the biggest threats often hide in plain sight. Inside his cell, the man with the cross tattoo made another entry in his hidden notebook. The detective's visit was an interesting development, but like everything else, it would become part of his plan. After all, the best place to hide is often right under the brightest spotlight. Small things started happening around the prison. At first, they seemed random, unconnected. A power outage that lasted exactly 3 minutes during the night shift. A maintenance door that wouldn't lock properly for 2 days. A delivery truck that arrived 30 minutes late, disrupting the usual morning routine. The guards didn't connect these incidents to the man with the cross tattoo. Why would they? He was in his cell during the power outage, reading quietly by flashlight. When the maintenance door had problems, he was helping organize books in the library. During the delivery delay, he was leading a morning prayer group in the chapel. But the detective, who had stayed in town despite her superior's doubts, saw patterns where others saw coincidence. She started a timeline, marking each small incident with colored pins on her motel room wall. Their test runs. She told her empty room, staring at the pattern emerging before her. He's testing response times. The prison's old security cameras began acting up, creating split-second blind spots in their coverage. The technology department blamed it on aging equipment and budget cuts. Nobody noticed how these glitches created perfect corridors of unwatched space, or how they happened at specific times during shift changes. In the cafeteria, the kitchen staff found their inventory counts slightly off. Never enough to raise alarms, just small discrepancies. Extra bread here, missing spices there. The head cook blamed it on sloppy counting. He didn't realize that each missing item had a purpose, becoming part of a larger plan. During outdoor exercise time, a brief fight broke out between two inmates. The guards rushed to break it up, following standard procedure. Nobody paid attention to how their response left certain areas unwatched for exactly 47 seconds. The man with the cross tattoo simply sat on his usual bench, appearing to read his book, but his eyes noted every detail. The prison chaplain noticed his favorite inmate seemed more focused during services, if that was even possible. "He's reaching a deeper level of faith," the chaplain told his colleagues proudly. He didn't notice how the prayer meetings had slowly shifted to different times, always coinciding with various security shifts and staff changes. In the library, books started disappearing and reappearing in slightly different places. The elderly librarian blamed her aging memory. She didn't realize that each moved book contained technical information about electronics, about security systems, about structural engineering. Each page viewed was another piece of the puzzle. The laundry room reported problems with their industrial dryers. Sometimes they would stop mid-cycle, requiring a system reset. The maintenance logs showed these stoppages created interesting patterns in the prison's power grid, like someone was mapping the electrical system's responses. One morning, the prison's weekly supply truck was delayed by a flat tire. This meant the gate stayed open 15 minutes longer than usual, disrupting the normal security rotation. The man with the cross tattoo watched from his library window, making mental notes about guard positions and response patterns. As these small disruptions continued, most of the prison staff remained oblivious to their significance. But the detective's wall of evidence grew more complex. She saw how each incident, no matter how minor, served a purpose: testing security, creating patterns, gathering information. In his cell at night, the man with the cross tattoo would lie awake, his fingers tracing the pattern on his neck. Each small chaos he created showed him something new about the prison's defenses. Each response revealed another weakness to exploit. His notebook grew fuller, its pages containing the blueprint of something much bigger than anyone suspected. The warden continued to dismiss the detective's concerns. "You're seeing conspiracy and coincidence," he told her during their latest meeting. But that night, as he reviewed the daily reports, a small doubt crept in. When he looked at each incident individually, everything had a logical explanation. But when he started thinking about them together, he shook his head, pushing the thought away. After all, their model prisoner was right where they could see him, peaceful and reformed, the cross on his neck a constant reminder of his supposed redemption. The truth broke like a storm on a clear day. The detective had been digging through old military files for weeks, following a hunch that kept her awake at night. When she finally found what she was looking for, her coffee cup slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor of her motel room. Staring at her computer screen, everything suddenly made sense. The man with the cross tattoo wasn't just any criminal. He was a former military intelligence operative, one of the best in the field. His specialty: complex infiltration operations. His record was spotless until he disappeared 5 years ago, taking with him secrets that could shake foundations. The detective's hands shook as she spread out her evidence. The careful way he mapped the prison's routines, that was military surveillance training. His ability to manipulate people without them realizing it, straight from the psychological operations playbook. Even his workout routine in the yard was maintaining military-grade physical conditioning. She rushed to the prison, demanding an emergency meeting with the warden. "You don't understand," she insisted, spreading photos and documents across his desk. "Everything he's done here, every single detail, it's all part of a bigger operation. The cross tattoo. It's not religious, it's a calculated choice." He knew exactly how the prison system would react to it. The warden leaned back in his chair, his face growing pale as he looked at the evidence. Photos of major heists across the country, each one perfectly executed, leaving no traces. Witness statements describing a mastermind who could turn any group into a precision team. Military records showing advanced training in everything from electronics to psychological warfare. In the prison chapel, the man with the cross tattoo sat quietly, knowing his cover was about to break. He planned for this moment, of course. Everything was already in motion. The detective was smart. She'd figured it out just as he knew someone eventually would. But she was also too late. The prison staff started looking at him differently as word spread. The guards noticed things they'd overlooked before. How he always seemed to be exactly where he needed to be. How every relationship he built served a purpose. The librarian remembered all the technical books he'd studied, realizing now they weren't just random choices. During lunch, the detective watched him through the cafeteria windows. Other inmates still clustered around him, unaware that their trusted advisor was actually a master strategist who'd been playing a long game. She saw now how he built his influence, not through force or fear, but through careful, calculated moves that would make any military commander proud. The warden called an emergency staff meeting. Security measures needed to be increased immediately. But as they discussed new protocols, the detective felt a chill run down her spine. "Don't you see?" She interrupted. "He wanted us to find out now. This is part of his plan, too." In his cell, the man with the cross tattoo remained calm as extra guards walked past. He'd spent months learning every detail of the prison's security systems, building a network of unwitting allies, and setting up his pieces like a chess grandmaster. His military training had taught him that timing was everything, and now the timer was counting down. That evening, as the sun set over the prison walls, the detective paced in the warden's office. "You need to move him," she insisted. "Maximum security, different facility, something." But she knew, even as she said it, that it was probably too late. The warden's phone rang. Another small security incident needed attention. Then another, and another. The man with the cross tattoo lay on his bunk, listening to the growing chaos outside his cell. His perfect prisoner facade had served its purpose. Now that they knew who he really was, the real show could begin. He touched the cross on his neck one last time, not a symbol of faith, but a reminder of his true mission. The operation was entering its final phase. The day of the prison-wide religious service arrived like any other morning. The warden had considered canceling it, given the recent revelations about their model prisoner, but the chaplain insisted it would cause too much unrest. Besides, he argued, we'll have extra security in place. The chapel filled slowly that morning. The man with the cross tattoo sat in his usual spot, surrounded by guards trying not to look obvious about watching him. The detective stood at the back, her eyes scanning constantly for signs of what she knew was coming. She just couldn't figure out how or when. The service began normally enough. The chaplain's voice echoed through the room, speaking about redemption and second chances. The irony wasn't lost on the detective as she watched the man with the cross tattoo bow his head in apparent prayer. That's when she noticed the first sign. A guard checking his watch exactly 3 times in 2 minutes. The prison's lights flickered briefly. Most people barely noticed, but the detective saw how several inmates shifted slightly in their seats. In the guard tower, someone reported a minor issue with the security cameras, just routine digital static. In the kitchen, the lunch prep team found themselves short-staffed as 2 workers called in sick. Halfway through the service, the chaplain paused to call for a moment of silent prayer. As the room grew quiet, the man with the cross tattoo lifted his head slightly. His fingers touched his neck, tracing the pattern that had fooled everyone for so long. That's when everything started happening at once. The power went out completely. Emergency lights kicked in, but they were dimmer than they should have been, creating shadows where there shouldn't be any. Radio communications went down next, not all at once, but in a cascade of static and confusion that spread through the prison's security network. The chapel erupted into what looked like chaos, but was actually a perfectly choreographed dance. Inmates moved in coordinated groups, each person knowing exactly where to go and what to do. The guards found themselves overwhelmed not by violence, but by confusion and misdirection. Outside the chapel, similar scenes played out across the prison. Kitchen workers accidentally blocked corridors with food carts. Maintenance issues sprang up simultaneously in different sections. Every problem was small on its own, but together they created gaps in security that grew larger by the second. The detective watched in stunned admiration as the plan unfolded. Each person played their part, most not even knowing they were part of something bigger. The man with the cross tattoo had turned the entire prison into an elaborate escape machine, and they'd all been just pieces on his board. In the confusion, nobody noticed at first that certain inmates were disappearing into the shadows. The man with the cross tattoo moved calmly through the chaos, each step calculated and precise. He'd memorized every blind spot, every timing gap, every weakness in the prison's defenses. The warden's office was flooded with reports from all sectors. Each incident seemed minor enough to handle individually, but together they overwhelmed the prison's response systems. By the time anyone realized what was really happening, the carefully orchestrated chain reaction was unstoppable. The detective tried to raise the alarm, but found the external phone lines were down. The backup systems were responding erratically, almost as if they'd been reprogrammed. She remembered all those small power outages, all those equipment tests. He'd been setting this up for months. Guards rushing to contain the situation found themselves responding to multiple false alarms, spreading their forces thin. Security doors malfunctioned in sequence, creating a maze of blocked and open paths that seemed random, but actually formed an escape route for those who knew the pattern. As the largest prison break in state history unfolded, the man with the cross tattoo walked calmly through his masterpiece of chaos. Every person he'd helped, every favor he'd granted, every relationship he built had been preparation for this moment. The cross tattoo that had once marked him as a potential threat had become the symbol of the greatest deception the prison system had ever seen. In the aftermath of the prison break, the detective stood in the warden's office, surrounded by local and federal agents. The morning sun cast long shadows through the windows as they tried to piece together what had happened. On the desk lay a single photograph, a close-up of the cross tattoo that had fooled them all. It was never about escaping prison, she explained to the gathered officials. That was just one part of something much bigger. She pinned up surveillance photos showing similar cross tattoos on people in different cities, each one perfectly positioned to help with whatever came next. The investigation revealed the truth bit by bit. The prison break wasn't an end. It was a beginning. While everyone had been focused on the quiet prisoner with the cross tattoo, his network had been growing far beyond the prison walls. Every person he'd met, every contact he'd made, was a potential asset in his larger plan. The warden sat heavily in his chair, reviewing security footage from the past months. Now he could see it all clearly. How the model prisoner had used their own prejudices and assumptions against them. They'd been so quick to label him as a religious extremist that they'd missed the real threat hiding in plain sight. Reports started coming in from other facilities across the country. The same pattern emerged: quiet inmates with cross tattoos, each one building their own networks of influence. The detective's wall of evidence grew larger as she connected the dots between seemingly unrelated incidents across different states. In the prison chapel, now empty except for investigators, the chaplain struggled to understand how he'd been so thoroughly deceived. He knew scripture better than anyone, he said, his voice hollow. The detective nodded sympathetically. He studied his targets as carefully as he studied those religious texts. The elderly librarian handed over stacks of log books, her hands trembling slightly. All those technical manuals he read. I thought he was planning for life after release. Now they knew those books had helped him understand every system, every security measure, not just in this prison, but in facilities across the country. As days passed, more details emerged. The cross tattoo wasn't just a disguise. It was a signal, a way for members of his organization to identify each other. What looked like a simple religious symbol actually contained coded information visible only to those who knew what to look for. The detective's phone rang constantly with updates from law enforcement nationwide. Each call revealed another piece of the puzzle: bank accounts, safe houses, hidden caches of equipment. The prison break had been just one move in a much larger game that was still unfolding. In the cell block, workers repaired the damage from the escape, They found his hidden notebook, but the pages were filled with what appeared to be religious observations and biblical quotes. It took the detective 3 days to realize they were encrypted instructions, waiting to be found by the right people. The media dubbed it the Cross Conspiracy, running endless stories about how one man had orchestrated the biggest prison break in history. But the detective knew better. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the first chapter becoming public. Late one night, as she stared at her evidence wall, the detective received a small package. Inside was a single photograph showing the man with the cross tattoo, now changed beyond recognition, sitting in what looked like an expensive office. On the back, written in careful handwriting, were the words, "The best disguise is the one they give you themselves." The warden retired a month later, unable to shake the knowledge that his model prisoner had used the prison's own prejudices and security systems against them. The cross tattoo that had once marked its wearer as a potential threat had become a symbol of how appearances could deceive. As the sun set on another day of investigation, the detective added one final note to her case file. The true genius of the plan wasn't just the escape. It was how he'd made everyone focus so hard on what they thought they understood that they missed what was really happening. The cross tattoo wasn't just a disguise. It was a mirror, reflecting back whatever people wanted to see, while the real operation continued unseen.